Good morning. It is Wednesday, March the 2nd, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have the strategy for defeating, the true conservative strategy for defeating the socialists, the true conservative tactics for defeating the socialists, the updated versions of who is the socialist and who is the true conservative, along with no free lunch and the emerging Republican majority. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now, the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 2nd. With my weapons, you will destroy strongholds. You are my mighty warriors. You are living on the earth, but you do not fight your battles with the weapons of this world. Instead, you use my power, which can destroy any fortress of evil. You've been trained for war and equipped with my weapons so that you can destroy the evil imaginations of this world and every bit of worldly knowledge that would keep people from obeying me. In my strength, you will break through all the enemy's walls and reduce his strongholds to ruins. You will turn back his sword and put an end to his splendor and cast his throne to the ground. He will cut off the nations, we will cut off the nations and demolish their strongholds. Their streets will be left deserted, and no one will pass through their land. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, Psalms 89, verse 40, and verses 43 through 44. Prayer declaration. Deliver me from my strong enemy, from them that are too strong for me. I am your battle axe and weapon of war. I am your anointed, and you give me great deliverance. I am your end-time warrior. Use me as your weapon against the enemy. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 2nd. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative tactics in support of true conservative strategy to defeat the socialists? Number one, and most important, that the true conservative refuse to prove a negative and insist that the socialist instead prove a positive. Thank you, thank you. So what is the true conservative strategy for defeating the socialists politically in this country? It is to attack the socialists from the bottom up, to demoralize and defeat the rank and file socialist that we encounter each and every day. And by so doing, we will discourage them from returning people like Nancy Pelosi to office. Thank you, thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. There's a strange split in thinking common to those on the religious left, who are quick to denounce the profit motive and commercialism. Yet, they seem to think that the key to happiness is giving people more stuff by enlisting the coercive power of government. This perverse way of thinking holds that social justice demands that we take money from those who have earned it and give it to those who have less of it. That's not social justice. That's materialism. Father Robert Sirica. This ought to be one of the primary arguments of defenders of a free economy, that our system seeks to create more fulfilled humans through a process of earned success, and the contrary systems are materialistic to the core. One system is focused on human achievement and flourishing. The other wants to merely give physical things to someone. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now the emerging Republican majority. And this is the next to last chapter of the book, How We Got Here. And the next chapter is going to be the conclusion. So the emerging Republican majority. Glass everywhere. That's what travelers saw when they entered Washington's new Dulles International Airport in 1959. Under a concrete roof that curved like the takeoff trajectory of a jet hung 4 vast windows without a retaining wall in sight. Beyond the glass, there was only the sky that America ruled in the way that Britain had once ruled the waves. It was from the air that America had dropped the atomic bombs that ended World War II. It was by air that America had sustained its hold on West Berlin during the darkest moment of the Cold War. It was through the air that the voice of America and Radio-Free Europe subverted the enemy Soviet Union. And it was via air that millions of newly prosperous Americans, their wallets stuffed with their almighty dollars, were inflicting the new industry of mass tourism upon the unhappy residents of Paris and Rome. You can still see the glass at Dulles, but you cannot see much of the sky. The vista overlooking the runways is now chopped off by a long wall, broken at intervals by doorways that lead to metal detectors and X-ray machines. It's incredible now, but within the memory of people now living, air passengers routinely walked from the door of the airport to their seat on the plane without being searched, scanned, or interrogated. This was not seen as anything remarkable. It was the way things were expected to be. Despite, or maybe because of, the international tension of the 1950s and 60s, despite the Berlin and Cuban crises, the Eisenhower and Kennedy years were a time when Americans were secure from dangers much below the level of a thermonuclear holocaust. Americans had reason to fear war, but they did not have to fear that some bomb-carrying fanatic might blow their airplane to smithereens. The first task of government is to guarantee the safety of the citizen, and that was a task that after 1970, Western governments performed less and less well. Over the Labor Day weekend of 1970, teams of Arab commandos seeking the release of Sirhan Sirhan, the assassin of Robert Kennedy, performed the spectacular feat of simultaneously hijacking 4 jumbo jets, two of them the property of American Airlines. Two of the hijacked jumbos were flown to Dawson's Field near Amman, Jordan. 400 passengers, 150 so of them Americans, were held hostage for 3 weeks until Jordan's King Hussein mobilized his army to force the release of the captives. The empty planes were blown up by the hijackers in a headline-grabbing act of destruction. The first hijacking recorded by history occurred in Peru in 1930, when officers attempting a coup diverted a plane to drop leaflets over Lima. The United States suffered them intermittently in the 50s, mostly by bank robbers commandeering planes to make good their exits. But so long as planes had relatively short flying ranges, and so long as there was nowhere within that range for a would-be hijacker to commandeer a plane to, hijacking's potential was severely limited. Then, on February 21, 1968, Lawrence Wilson Rhodes stepped aboard a Delta Airlines DC-8, pointed a pistol at a stewardess after takeoff, and demanded to be flown to Havana. Over the next 2 years, his example would inspire an assortment of crooks on the lam, lunatics, black nationalists, and Castroite radicals to hijack 38 American planes, 37 of them to Cuba. None of these hijackings resulted in any death or injury. The Cuban authorities behaved politely enough, feeding the abducted passengers roast beef dinners and selling them the famous local rum and cigars at duty-free prices before sending them home. These early hijackings were not without their ludicrous aspects. "Take this plane to Cuba" became the punchline of innumerable wearisome nightclub comedians, but their import was not funny at all. The United States was no longer able to protect its citizens from international anarchy, and through the 1970s, international anarchy obtruded itself ever more terrifyingly into American consciousness. Back in a minute. Thank you. Between 1968 and 1981, terrorists murdered the American ambassadors to Guatemala, Sudan, Cyprus, and Lebanon, the Prime Minister of Jordan, the Prime Minister of Spain, the chairman of West Germany's second largest bank, the frontrunner for the presidency of Italy, the uncle of the Queen of England, the President of Egypt, and very nearly the commander of NATO and the Pope. Thousands of perfectly ordinary people were killed or maimed by international and domestic terrorism in Argentina, France, West Germany, and Uruguay. The Irish Republican Army, an organization largely financed by money raised in the United States, murdered 2,261 English and Irish people between 1969 and 1982. It was responsible for 7,500 bombings that claimed the lives of more than 600 people and deliberately crippled more than 1,000 journalists, businessmen, and ordinary fellow Catholics who failed, in the opinion of the IRA, to show insufficient enthusiasm for the cause. No grievance seemed too obscure to provoke terrorism. In May 1977, a gunman demanding independence from Indonesian rule for South Malacca, a territory once known only to clever 11-year-olds in the National Geographic Society's annual Geography Bee, seized 105 school children and their 6 teachers at a school in the small Dutch town of Bovensmilde. Another South Malaccan band took a hostage 50 adults aboard a commuter train. After nearly a 3-week standoff, Dutch Marines assaulted the train and the school. All the children were saved alive. 2 adult hostages and all the terrorists were killed. No portion of the Earth's surface was too idyllic to escape. Black nationalists murdered the Governor-General of Bermuda and his military aide as the 2 men walked the governor's dog after dinner in March 1973. A British diplomat and a French-Canadian cabinet minister were kidnapped in October 1970 by terrorists demanding the independence of Quebec. The diplomat survived. The minister was murdered. No season of goodwill was too sacred to be sullied. A team of Palestinian terrorists attacked the Munich Olympics in September 1972 in an attempt to kidnap the Israeli Olympic team. The incident ended in the violent death of all 11 athletes. No taboo is too awesome to go unviolated. One leader of the German Red Army faction, usually known as the Baader-Meinhof Gang, drew up plans to bomb the headquarters of what remained of Jewish communal and religious life in West Berlin. In order to get rid of this thing about Jews that we've all had to have since the Nazi time. He was caught before the plans could be carried out. Terrorism worked in the sense that it intimidated. In the summer of 1976, 2 German terrorists and 5 Arab hijackers seized an Air France jetliner en route to Tel Aviv and flew it to Uganda's Entebbe airport. Ugandan dictator Idi Amin had food and supplies waiting and deployed troops around the perimeter of the airport as soon as the passengers were marched into it. On the ground, the Germans took command. They released the non-Jews and held the Jews. Among the hostages at Entebbe, wrote a leading authority on the Baader-Meinhof gang, there were a few who had been in Hitler's concentration camps. Once again, they found themselves being sorted out, Jews from non-Jews. The Jews selected to die. Once again, they were ordered about by guards with guns, shouted at to move quickly, schnell, this time by a German woman hijacker who also felt it was necessary to slap them. One of the captors went up to Bose, Wilfred Bose, the leader, and showed him a number indelibly branded on his arm. He told him that he had got it in a Nazi concentration camp. He said that he had supposed that a new and different generation had grown up in Germany. But with this experience of Bose and his girl comrade, he found it difficult to believe that the Nazi movement had died. Bose replied that this was something quite different from Nazism. Israeli commandos flew 2,000 miles and attacked the airfield in the middle of the night, scattered the Ugandans, killed the terrorists, and saved all but one of the hostages. The world's political leaders did not dare applaud. UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim condemned the Israeli raid on Entebbe as a violation of Ugandan sovereignty. The government of France, the owner of the hijacked plane, offered not a single word of thanks. The Ford administration managed to sum up only a milky expression of satisfaction that the lives of the passengers had been saved. Supineness in the face of terrorist violence was such a distinctive trait of the 1970s that the phenomenon acquired a useful shorthand name, the Stockholm Syndrome. After an incident that occurred in the summer of 1973, 2 ex-cons attempted to rob a bank in the Swedish capital. Police burst in on the robbery and, to protect themselves, the crooks grabbed 4 hostages and fled into the bank vault. The police besieged the robbers for 5 days and finally flushed them out by drilling holes in the vault ceiling and dropping tear gas inside. Then a curious thing happened. One of the hostages emerged to announce that she had fallen in love and intended to marry the lead crook. The syndrome entered an ordinary speech a year later when Patty Hearst, media heiress, threw in her lot with the political radicals who had kidnapped her. She denounced her family and fiancé on tape recordings. I have changed, grown, I've become conscious and can never go back to the life we led before. My love has grown into an unselfish love of my comrades here, in prison, and on the streets. Hearst even toted a gun alongside her captors in an April 1974 San Francisco bank robbery. The Stockholm Syndrome seemed to grip the whole world. All too often, it was the targets of terrorism who endured the blame for the gunman's crimes. The influential French newspaper Le Monde expressed this line of reasoning forcefully in a 1977 commentary on the outrages of the Baader-Meinhof gang. Only a society that is itself monstrous can produce monsters. The Carter administration fell victim to the Stockholm Syndrome, too. In a speech given soon after the Iranians took 52 American diplomats in Tehran hostage, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance urged Americans not to get too upset over the incident. Most Americans now recognize that we alone cannot dictate events. This recognition is not a sign of America's decline. It is a sign of growing American maturity in a complex world. When Vance's boss, President Jimmy Carter, warned a few weeks later that there was a limit to American maturity, Khomeini mocked him. He sometimes threatens us militarily and at other times economically, but he's aware himself that he is beating on an empty drum, Khomeini said. Neither does Carter have the guts for military action, nor would anyone listen to him. When Carter finally attempted military action, which crashed and burned in the Iranian desert in April 1980, Vance resigned in protest. But America was not an empty drum. The Iran hostage-taking snapped the country out of its defeatist funk. Disc jockeys began playing a comic new song to the tune of Barbara Ann, Bomb, 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 Iran. The popular joke asked, what's flat and glows in the dark? The answer, Iran, 24 hours after Ronald Reagan's inauguration. The Iranians must have heard the joke too. Before the 24 hours had elapsed, all the hostages were released. The humiliations of the Carter years stiffened America's spine. A constellation of influential ex-Democrats, Paul Nitze, Irving Kristol, Eugene Rostow, and Norman Podhoretz, formed a committee on the present danger to rally the country for rearmament. In 1975, only 18% of Americans said the country was spending too little on defense. In 1978, still only 29% said the country was spending too little. But by the 1980, an overwhelming 60% worried the country was spending too little. Back in a minute. Thank you. Carter never managed to understand what the country was bothered about. He scorned Ronald Reagan's demand for firmness and resolve, telling reporters for the Dayton Daily News that Reagan's criticisms of his policies reflected Reagan's apparent inability to understand the complexity of arms control. If you got just a strong military and you're jingoistic in spirit and just show the macho of the United States, Carter explained to 50 Chicago suburbanites a month before the 80 election, that is an excellent way to lead our country toward war. The Oval Office is not a place for simplistic answers. It's not a place for shooting from the hip. It's not a place for snap judgments that might have serious consequences. But if the choices were simplistic answers or Carter's answers, simplicity could look appealing. In September 1980, Leon Jaworski, a former Watergate special prosecutor, signed up as the honorary chairman of Democrats for Reagan. When reminded by a reporter of his earlier harsh assessment of the Republican nominee, not 5 months before, Jaworski had described him as an extremist whose over-the-counter simplistic remedies and shop-worn platitudes trouble the open-minded and informed voter. Jaworski replied, "I would rather have a competent extremist than an incompetent moderate." American politics have been trending toward conservatism since the early 1960s. A conservative, went a vintage joke of the 1960s, is a liberal who has been mugged. If that definition is true, then it's surprising that the swing was not more overwhelmingly than it actually was. In 1962, a bare majority of Americans, 51%, described themselves as conservative. 12 years later, 59% did so. In the 8 presidential elections between 68 and 96, Democrats' best showing was in 1976, when Jimmy Carter won 50.1% of the vote. In the Republicans' best showing, 1972, the Grand Old Party won 60.7%. More tellingly, over those 8 elections, the Democrats averaged 43.7% of the vote to the Republicans' 49.1%. A self-congratulatory liberal myth of the 1980s fixes the blame for this trend to the far right on American racism. Liberalism faltered, this theory explains, because it heroically immolated itself for the cause of civil rights. But the self-congratulatory myth disregards the overwhelming popularity of the civil rights cause everywhere outside the white South in the years before 1964 and slights the millions of black votes added to the Democrat column by the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It was the collapse of social order at home and the ebbing of American prestige abroad, not the Civil Rights Act, that shattered Democrat liberalism. As anti-Vietnam protests battled police outside the 1968 Democrat convention, a pollster asked the American public whether Chicago Mayor Richard Daley had done the right thing to unleash his cops to club and arrest unarmed students carrying "We Are Your Children" placards. 66% said yes. Mayor Daley was right. Only 20% said no. The Daley poll asked Americans to take sides, not between whites and blacks, but between the forces of order and the forces of disorder. By inventing excuses for riots, condoning crime, and cringing before terrorism, Democratic liberals convinced the public that only conservatives and Republicans could be trusted to defend American society. Since 1960, observed Yale anthropologist Jonathan Reeder, the Jews and Italians of Canarsie have embellished and modified the meaning of liberalism, associating it with profligacy, spinelessness, malevolence, masochism, elitism, fantasy, anarchy, idealism, softness, irresponsibility, and sanctimoniousness. The term conservative acquired connotations of pragmatism, character, reciprocity, truthfulness, stoicism, manliness, realism, hardness, vengeance, strictness, and responsibility. In 1980, the Roosevelt Democrats of Canarsie voted overwhelmingly in favor of Ronald Reagan, the Jewish precincts nearly as heavily as the Italian ones. Back in a minute. Thank you. Race obviously entered into this. It was race that embarrassed liberals into laxness on crime, for instance, and race that enticed them into dubious social experiments like busing. Race surely played some role in ending the mid-century infatuation with big and costly government, but even more damage to the cause of social welfare was done by those liberals who refused to accept that Americans could have any reason except racism for worrying about the growth of a dependent underclass. Hubert Humphrey roared in 1976 at those candidates who make an attack on welfare, making an attack on government programs, on blacks, on minorities, on the cities. It's a disguised new form of racism, a disguised new form of conservatism. But Americans were not attacking government programs. By 1973, almost 1/4 of American young people thought that they had a right to leisure. Almost 1/2 thought that they had a right to a college education for their children. More than 1/2 thought that they had a right to the best available medical care. They were not even turning against social welfare. What they were doing was rethinking welfare, insisting that while individuals were entitled to help, they were also obliged to help themselves. Pollsters who asked, should government do everything possible to aid the poor, found a sharp drop in the number of people who strongly agreed, from 30% in 1975 to 18% in 1983. But when the question was turned around, or is it primarily each person's responsibility to take care of themselves, pollsters found no increase in the number of people who believed in strict personal responsibility. Americans were not returning to the era of laissez-faire. Rugged individualism no longer swayed them. Neither, however, did the social democratic ethos of the middle years of the century. Americans were moving on to something new, a creed that blended the antique ideal of self-reliance with a soft sense of entitlement for those who made some minimal effort on their own behalf. It was a fuzzy political idea, perfect for the fuzzy era to come, and the struggle to imbue it with meaning would define the politics of the post-Cold War era. And that was the emerging Republican majority from the book How We Got Here, the 70s, and tomorrow will be the conclusion of this book. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.